This is Ari Koretsky, and welcome to Jews You Should Know, introducing the broader community to interesting and inspiring Jewish men and women making a difference in our world. Some are already famous, some not yet so, but each is a Jew you should know. And we are back with another fabulous episode of Jews You Should Know. The next couple of weeks are going to actually be somewhat more intellectual, academic, whatever word you might choose. The guests are real powerhouses of intellect and are focused on various different arenas of academic study. In this case, this week, starting with Yoram Ettinger, a real expert in the U.S.-Israeli relationship, a 30-year veteran of both Israel's civil service as well as in the private sector for a nonprofit foundation, doing research on Arab demography, United States-Israel symbiosis, and many, many other topics. Yoram is a fascinating figure with a wealth of knowledge, but also a very warm and passionate person who I really enjoyed speaking with. And again, the next couple of weeks probably will be people of the same genre of guest, people who have made real forays into a particular area of academic study, but who also are bringing their knowledge to the popular masses in an attempt to inspire and influence the Jewish world. A reminder, as you are listening, to please make sure you are subscribed so that future episodes will come to you without any effort, and also please share with your friends, family, acquaintances, even enemies if you so choose, to do the same. Also, a reminder to follow us on social media, Instagram at Jews You Should Know spelled out fully, Facebook the same, Twitter Jews You Should Know with the letter U instead of the Y-O-U. We greatly appreciate it. And now, without further ado, to our conversation with renowned Israeli patriot, civil servant, and thought leader, Yoram Ettinger. And we are here with Yoram Ettinger, a renowned policy expert on many, many areas relating to the state of Israel. How are you, Yoram?
I'm doing very well. Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk with you.
Likewise, I think I first heard your name from Sarah Stern of Emet.
Well, she's quite an Eshet Chayil, a woman of valor, both in her personal family life and increasingly in the area of U.S.-Israel relations.
Absolutely. And she's a powerhouse in that area. And when I asked her about different recommendations she might have, probably about a year ago when I interviewed her, yours was one of the first names that she mentioned. So I'm glad we finally were able to connect. So Yoram, take it from the top. We hear your wonderful Israeli accented English. So tell us exactly where you're from and where you grew up and so forth.
Well, I reside in Jerusalem, and I've had some 50 years experience in the context of U.S.-Israel relations, which started after my military service here in Israel, where I came to El Paso, Texas, to do my undergraduate. From there, I went to UCLA, UTEP, and from there I went to UCLA to do my master's. And at the end of my time at UCLA, I was asked or offered by the Israeli Consul General at that time in Los Angeles to join their team as an information officer, which I did for 3 years at the Israeli Consulate General in Los Angeles. Then I came back to Israel. I established and headed a Middle East research unit in the Israeli civil service. And I did that for 10 years. And after 10 years, I was posted by the Israeli government as Consul General to the southwestern states based in Houston, Texas, which got me acquainted with Texas culture, with bluegrass, country western songs, and state of mind.
And barbecue, I hope.
Little of that as well, but mostly, and I appreciate it until today, mostly the contact with the small town America, country types and country state of mind. And then I went back to Israel. I was the head of the government press office for 2 years. And then I returned to the U.S., to the Israeli embassy in Washington, in charge of our congressional relations, which was the most challenging, exciting time in my civil service career in the Israeli civil service. And I familiarized myself with the concept of co-equal, co-determining U.S. legislature, which many Americans, let alone many Israelis, fail to absorb, fail to understand. And then I went back to Israel at the end of '92. I retired from the Israeli civil service, established my own operation, which I sustain until today. And this is under the Second Thought, a nonprofit foundation, Second Thought, which, just like the name suggests, is always seeking the second way of thinking, namely out of the box thinking, non-conventional approach to U.S.-Israel relations, to the Palestinian issue, to the Jewish-Arab demographic context, and many other such issues.
Wonderful sweeping overview of a very busy and exceptional professional life. What got you initially interested in these kinds of things? Where did you grow up in Israel?
Well, I grew up, strangely enough, in Tel Aviv, and growing up in Israel, to be honest, and I'm embarrassed to say, I could care less about ideology or politics or national security. I was fully preoccupied with playing soccer and basketball and tennis. It was my years of undergraduate and graduate in the U.S. where I was exposed for the first time to the challenge faced by Israel on American campuses, in the U.S. at large, later on Capitol Hill. And for the first time, I realized the significance of being a Jew, of being a member of the Jewish people, of being a citizen of the Jewish state. And it was the first time where I was also exposed to the very unique ties between U.S. and Israel, which are very, very different from any other set of ties, whether it is U.S. ties with other countries or Israel ties with other countries. I'm not familiar with any type of international relations which resemble the U.S.-Israel connection, which, by the way, goes back way, way before the establishment of Israel, many years before the Holocaust. In fact, many, many years before the organized Jewish community in the U.S. It goes back all the way to 1620, the arrival of the Mayflower to the newly found land today, the United States. That's when the roots or the seeds of very special U.S.-Israel relations were planted.
Beautiful. So interestingly, you say that growing up, you didn't really have much interest. did your time in the Army, or what did you do in the Army? And did your time there spark anything, or was only once you went to the U.S., to Texas, El Paso, that you first started to gain this appreciation?
Well, in the military, I was a first lieutenant in the Israeli artillery. And once again, I was not involved with any youth movement, which at that time was very popular in Israel. I was fully preoccupied with Israeli sports and my own personal sports, as I said, soccer, basketball, some tennis. But I remember at UT El Paso, there was a noontime panel one day which presented an anti-Zionist rabbi from New York, an Arab League activist from San Francisco who came to campus, and a local UT El Paso poli-sci professor. They tore Israel apart. And there was nobody on the panel or in the audience who had anything positive to say about Israel. I'm embarrassed to say that with my lack of knowledge, information, interest, I was totally useless in that setting. But I came to the home of my uncle, my late uncle and aunt, who hosted me during my 3 years in El Paso, and I was shocked. And I shared with them my sentiments. A few weeks later, was a telephone call from the Israeli student organizations in New York who alerted me to a rising anti-Israel tide on American campuses. And mind you, that was in the late 1960s. And they urged me to become involved. And that got me into a totally different direction from my studies, which had to do with business administration and accounting. In fact, I was certified as a CPA in the US while I did my graduate studies at UCLA. But increasingly, I became involved in pro-Jewish, pro-Israeli activities. I spent my vacations studying in Los Angeles library, studying Zionist history, Jewish history, U.S. history, and that, in a way, set me up where I'm here today, fully 100% convinced and meshed Zionist, Jew, and a person who considers U.S.-Israel relations, again, to be very special two-way street, benefiting both the U.S. as well as Israel.
I'm surprised to hear that in Texas, there was such an anti-Israel sentiment. You know, outside of Austin, you think of Texas as a more conservative state and culture.
Well, that panel that I refer to did not reflect the sentiments on campus. In fact, I benefited from pro-Israeli sentiments on the campus at large. I joined a fraternity, which for me as an Israeli was like a Hollywood experience. I used to.
Which fraternity did you join?
Well, it was not a Jewish fraternity. They accepted me in spite of the fact that I was a Jew. They had difficult time, quite frankly, as I had, to decide whether I was a Jew religiously or nationally or ethnically or culturally. They were fascinated by me being an Israeli. I assume playing soccer, I was the captain of the UTEP soccer team. So that provided tailwind. I played basketball, not the level of Americans, but I could play with my fraternity brothers. So I was accepted. I was in fact elected the treasure of the student body. I enjoyed very much the positive welcome by the student body, by the staff, the academic staff. That anti-Israel panel was an exceptional event, but it hit me very, very strong, and it awakened me. It awakened me to a challenge, which I realized later. Not until I got to UCLA did I realize the immensity of the challenge faced by Israel in the U.S. at large, especially, but not only on American campuses. And that led me to further research and studies, which exposed me to the reality of the U.S. and to the huge, still untapped potential of American goodwill towards Israel, not so much in the big urban centers, New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Miami, etc., but especially in small town America, and more so in what Americans called the flyover areas of America.
Flyover country, yeah.
Right, which many Americans do not frequent, let alone Israelis. But once you land there, you realize that there is a significant historical, somewhat religious, and I'm not referring only or not mostly to evangelical folks. I'm referring to the public at large, but they have high sentiments of patriotism, high appreciation of national security, high respect for people who stand on their own, who defy significant, huge challenges. And that has led that part of America, again, the flyover parts of America, the small town part of America, to unique positive attitude towards Israel. And as I have increasingly realized, that type of special two-way street relations has provided much rate of return, much benefits to Israel, but also, and much more so, to the United States itself, especially in recent years when it comes to dollar terms, national security, and dollar terms economy.
What brought you originally to go to college in America?
Well, my late uncle, along with my aunt, they invited me after the conclusion of my military service to come and get to know the United States, and if I wish, also to study. And it was a very valuable experience, which until today impacts my daily life. It introduced me for the first time in a serious manner to the English language. I could speak no English when I came to El Paso.
Wow. And you went straight to college.
I went, yeah, I did. But again, my uncle and my aunt invested much time every single day polishing up my English, enhancing my familiarity with the English language. In fact, they convinced me to enroll in regular English classes rather than English for foreigners.
Wow.
I was, as far as I remember, the only foreigner enrolled in such classes. It required many more hours of studying on my part, but it was an extremely profitable, beneficial investment. And simultaneously, it got me acquainted with part of America which is rarely exposed to the vast majority of Israelis, namely small town America, although El Paso is not a small town, but the style of living in El Paso is much closer to small town than to big urban center.
What did you enjoy about the small town mentality and approach?
Well, as first of all, as they say in Texas, people don't only shoot straight, they talk straight. And I appreciate much more candor, even if it doesn't sound pleasant at first. I appreciate much more honest, authentic candor than politeness, which sometimes is pretty artificial.
Well, it
And
sounds like Israelis as well are very much in that vein.
especially when it comes to Israel, because as you said, Israelis also are not known for artificial politeness, or sadly not known for politeness, and that obviously made it easier on me. I can share with you an experience when I was consul general. I was very, very anxious to meet a certain powerful Republican mover and shaker in Midland, Texas. That was back in 85, 86, when Texas was still mostly a Democratic, politically Democratic state. And I wanted to expand my network beyond the obvious office holders. And I was recommended to meet that person who showed absolutely no interest to meet me. And that time there was no email yet. So letter after letter, telephone call after telephone were simply ignored by him until one day a mutual friend from a small town next to Midland, Odessa, managed to schedule a meeting. I flew from Houston to Midland, and I remember entering his office, and this Texas oil man, by the way, an independent oil producer, an independent oil engineer, he welcomed me in a very, very unusual way. And I quote, Mr. Ettinger, if not for our mutual friend, there wouldn't be a meeting, because I don't think there is anything in common between you and me. Now, those days I used to walk around with my Stetson hat, my Tony Lama boots, and I had the Texas pin on the lapel of my suit. So I pointed at the Texas pin, and he said, "What do you mean? This is my Texas flag." And I said, "Absolutely. This is the flag of the Lone Star State, and I represent the state of the Lone Star of David." And I went on to present to him the challenge of Lone Stars and how that challenge forces us to enhance our achievements, to excel. And I said, the difference is pretty small. Your neighbors, Oklahoma, New Mexico, Arkansas, Louisiana, they don't like you. Some of them even envy you and hate you. Our neighbors, they hate us, they envy us, they don't like us, but they also terrorize us. And they assault us militarily. But both of us, Texas and Israel, have faced adversity from day one, and therefore both of us excel and shall excel. Cut a long story short, that very unique person, as I said, he was at that time probably the Republican kingmaker, mover and shaker in Texas, still around, pretty active, has become a very supportive of the U.S.-Israel connection, invited me to Texas for 2 days to present to his friends the benefits to America from America's ties with Israel. And more recently, May of 2016, I was in Texas at the Republican State Convention. And while I was walking the corridor, suddenly I heard somebody yelling, "Yoram!" I look around, here's my friend. And it was not a handshake, it was a hug, like two brothers. And we have become, in many respects, two brothers, revisiting after many years of missing each other. And he took me around to introducing me to his friends. But that's only one example of the huge, still untapped potential, especially within the non-Jewish community in the U.S. And as I said before, I don't refer only and not especially to evangelicals, but all Christians in America, I believe fundamentally hold Israel in high respect. The problem is many of them don't realize it. And they need a conversation and exposure for them to realize that U.S.-Israel relations is a natural combination, which again benefits both sides, not only Israel.
Did you have any relationship with the Bush family during that time?
I met at that time oil producer Bush Jr. one time, but it was not very, very deep, long meeting. But I met number of friends of the Bush family, both during my service at the Israeli embassy in Washington, and since I have become active within this nonprofit foundation, Second Thought. This involvement has taken me back to the U.S. annually, 3-5 times on visits ranging from 2 weeks to 5 weeks visit. And every visit takes me also back to Texas for a couple of days. So I've had opportunities to meet a number of friends of the Bush family. But again, when it comes to Texas, that Lone Star mentality, that country mentality, that defiance of the jagged cutting edge of nature mentality, that has made most Texans, not all, but most Texans, natural allies of the U.S.-Israel front.
Has that become more difficult over time where the other, let's say the surrounding states, have begun to portray Israel as the Goliath and themselves as David, whereas in the earlier days of the state, it was pretty self-evident that Israel was the Lone Star, as you put it, was a small, beleaguered state suffering at the hands of a sea of surrounding enemies?
Well, we are still small star, and irrespective of the public relation campaign or propaganda campaign trying to portray Israel as evil, the deep Judeo-Christian state of mind in American history has made it relatively easy to present to Americans the common denominator. The challenge is to familiarize ourselves, Israelis or American Jews or any friend of Israel, to familiarize ourselves with those 400-year-old roots. For instance, when I assumed my role at the Israeli embassy dealing with the U.S. Congress, I paid obviously many visits to Capitol Hill. When I first entered the hall of the House of Representatives, I noticed that around the hall, inside the hall, the General Assembly, there are 23 busts of the heads of the leading 23 lawgivers in human history. And lo and behold, at the center, our own Moses. And not only at the center, but he is confronting the Speaker of the House. And more than that, the bust of Moses is the only one of the 23 looking straight. All the other busts are in profile. Upon being introduced to that very intriguing setup, I asked the House, the Capitol building curator, why is this bus different than all other buses? And the House curator said, aren't you a Jew from Israel? Don't you know that Moses is the source of human law and the other lawgivers are the byproduct of the source? And therefore, the source stares at the speaker. So the speaker will always realize what's the source, and the byproducts stare at the source, and therefore they are in profile, and Moses looks straight. All you need to do is cross a small street between the Capitol building and the U.S. Supreme Court, and as you go upstairs and you enter the main hall of the U.S. Supreme Court, you realize that above the seats of the 9 Supreme Court justices at the ceiling. There is a statue of Moses holding the tablets, staring at the 9 Supreme Court justices. And this is one of 8 sculptures and engravements of Moses and the 10 Commandments throughout the Supreme Court building. And the same thing exists throughout the US. There is the 10 Commandments monument on the ground of the Texas Capitol Hill. And there is an identical monument of the 10 Commandments on the ground of the Oklahoma and the Arkansas Capitol buildings. And when you watch the political discourse in the US, people refer to major movers and shakers like the Moses of our time, and one does not need to be special ally of Israel to resort to biblical metaphors. The late Robert Byrd from West Virginia, who was one of the most problematic legislators when it came to U.S.-Israel relations.
He was a former Klansman, right?
Right, but he was renowned for resorting to biblical metaphors. I remember Tom Harkin. Tom Harkin was not anti-Israel senator, but certainly was not one of the leading supporters of Israel in the U.S. Senate. And Tom Harkin, one of the leading doves and liberals among Democrats on Capitol Hill before he retired, I believe, in 2014, Tom Harkin led the Obamacare battle in the Senate, and at the conclusion of the battle, he assembled the press conference, and the first sentence uttered by the very dovish liberal Democratic Senator Tom Harkin at the press conference was, "I would like to congratulate Majority Leader at that time, Senator Harry Reid, for displaying the humility of Job and the might of Samson and the wisdom of Solomon. I wish that secular members at the Knesset in Israel will resort to such metaphors when they conduct Knesset debates. I wish that we would have at the Knesset or the Israeli Supreme Court the statue of Moses and the 10 Commandments." But those are few of litany of examples that demonstrate the deep roots binding together the United States on the one hand and Israel, the Jewish state, on the other hand.
Do you worry that in today's climate, there's been a pronounced secularization of the United States, certainly the United States elite? Do you worry that that shared ethic is disappearing?
Well, I'm obviously concerned about potential impact of the changed demography in the U.S. upon the future of the U.S. in general, not only U.S. ties with Israel. And I'm concerned because the globe, the world, humanity need a very assertive, very strong, very independently acting United States in order to minimize global instability, global violence, global incoherence. A U.S. which deteriorates as far as its military might, as far as its economic might, would be less of an asset to global stability. And I derive my concern from the European precedent. Europe today is not the Europe of 30 or 40 years ago. It's increasingly a liability upon the world at large rather than an asset for the world at large. It does not constitute water to global fires, but increasingly more fuel to global fires. And my concern is for the U.S. to retain its very positive, unique role in leading global reality. A U.S. which becomes just another member of the UN would stop being the classic U.S. We need a U.S. that follows classic American ideals of patriotism, of independence of action, rather than a U.S. which follows the rest of the world.
Yeah, and it seems like you fear that that's changing. Is that a function of changing demographics and demographic composition, or of changing ideology even from within the same demographic?
Well, it's both, but demography is moving pretty fast, has moved pretty fast in recent years, and certainly that has produced change. I can share with you my own personal experience. I keep very close contact with Capitol Hill. I visit the Hill 3, sometimes 5 times a year, and increasingly I meet staffers bearing Muslim last names. Now, it does not have to mean a departure from classic U.S. ideology or policy, but it certainly shed light on the potential. The fact that you have today more Muslim legislators, not many, still low single digit. But the question is, does it open the door for significantly more such legislators or not? And the issue is not really whether they are Muslims or Christians or Jews. The issue is the ideology that guides them. And certainly, the U.S. has benefited from what Americans refer to as Judeo-Christian ideals, which again go back to the early pilgrims and then the founding fathers, and specifically the formulation of the U.S. Constitution, which relied to a large extent not only on leading British and French philosophers, but also on the Old Testament and specifically on the 5 books of Moses, and that has produced the most productive ever country in the world, certainly in the last 400 years. And the question is, would a departure from those Judeo-Christian values, ideals, would it erode the sophistication or the contribution by the U.S. to itself as well as to the global community or not? There's certainly the possibility of such an erosion, which could undermine the U.S. and therefore the U.S. ties with the rest of the world, including Israel.
Can you share with us any other stories of your time spent in diplomacy and in advocacy around the world? It sounds like until 1992, you were engaged in this sort of process in a more official capacity, as it were in a representative capacity on behalf of the Israeli government. And since 1992, more of as a private citizen and as a member of a think tank of sorts, of a foundation that is spreading or promoting the U.S.-Israel relationship. What have been some highlights for you over the last 20 or so years of this kind of work?
Well, my efforts have focused on an attempt to always highlight the American interest. I do not approach folks on Capitol Hill, off Capitol Hill, by promoting Israeli interest or so-called Israeli drift. I've always tried to focus on the American drift. And one such example was at a time when there were attempts by Israeli leaders to retreat from the Golan Heights. And I remember visiting office of some significant U.S. senators and presenting to them the impact of Israeli withdrawal from the Golan on America's interests. And the initial reaction was, oh, come on, Yoram, that's between you and the Syrians. And then my response to that was, well, if Israel retreats from the Golan Heights, there is a question what would happen. I'm talking about the mid 1990s, early 1990s, after the Oslo Accords of 1993. And I said, if Israel withdraws from the Golan Heights down to the Lake of Galilee, what would happen to the 5 to 7 mechanized armored Syrian divisions which are stationed between the Golan Heights and Damascus, attempting to protect Syria from a possible Israeli invasion on Damascus? And again, the response was, who cares? Whatever Assad wants to do, that was Papa Assad, let him do that. And I said, well, what about taking 5 of those divisions to the border between Syria and Jordan, which is perceived in Damascus as part of southern Syria? Do you think the Jordanian military has the capacity to withstand a Syrian invasion to Jordan? Or do you welcome the possibility that you will be asked to deploy military power and fight on behalf of Jordan against pro-Soviet Syria? And always the response was dumbfounded stare, and then Yoram, sit down, let's talk about it. We never thought about that possibility. And more than that, my concern at that time was about a very, very illogical, I would call it even suicidal proposal forwarded by some Israeli leaders to have American troops on the Golan Heights, ensuring the existence, the survivability of the Syrian-Israeli agreement. And my question to American legislators at that time was, do you realize that when you send American troops to the Golan Heights, you send them to an area where they're going to be surrounded by a bunch of very lunatic Islamic terror organizations? And how long before the first American soldier is either injured or murdered or kidnapped or cut to pieces? And what impact would that have, for instance, on anti-Semitism in the United States? And once again, I found out that neither American Jewish leaders nor congressional leaders in Washington even contemplated such a scenario. And I know for a fact that that type of scenario had an impact on the attitude by very significant American leaders of the House and mostly in the Senate, which led to the withdrawal from such an irresponsible scenario.
What are some other features of the Israeli-American relationship that you like to highlight as beacons for American development?
Well, one example is the city where I reside, Jerusalem. The current administration is the first one to recognize reality, to recognize history. And unlike the old predecessors from President Truman in 48 until President Obama, the current one recognized Jerusalem as capital of Israel, but more than that, has transferred the embassy to Jerusalem. Most people consider that to be as a very, very outstanding gesture towards the Jewish state. And while it is, at the same time, it is consistent with America's best interest. And I believe that the current administration, and especially the president, his national security advisor, John Bolton, whom I've known for the last 30 years, certainly former Congressman Mike Pompeo, the current Secretary of State, and above all, the ambassador to Israel, David Friedman, they all understand that relocating the embassy to Jerusalem also serves America's best interest. Because for America, for so many years, to refrain from recognizing Israel, Jerusalem as capital of Israel and Jerusalem as capital of Israel reflected deterrence by Americans from threats of terrorism, deterrence in face of pressure by Arabs. And that type of American profile, which is deterred by Arab pressure, by Arab threats, by Muslim terrorists, has eroded the clout of America in the global sphere and in its counter confrontations with the Ayatollahs of Iran, let alone the arm wrestling with Russia and China. For the U.S. to relocate the embassy to Jerusalem, recognizing Jerusalem as capital of Israel, also it basically amplified a statement. U.S. is not deterred by pressure. U.S. does not retreat in face of Islamic terrorist threats. The U.S. does the right thing. The U.S. recognizes history. And the fact is that contrary to the doomsday sayers, there has not been an adverse reaction since that game-changing decision by President Trump. And the same thing, by the way, goes for the Golan Heights, recognizing reality, namely Golan Heights historically and certainly from national security point of view is an integral part of Israel, should have been natural for the U.S. But the fact is that it took number of presidents before a president arrived and deciding to do the right thing, which has served America's interest, enhanced America's posture of deterrence, which is so critical for America's homeland security, America's national security, and America's standing in the world at large.
What are the major projects that you work on today? What are some of the actual research that you're doing or specific initiatives that you're leading? I've read that you're a major proponent, or perhaps I could say opponent, of what you might term demographic fatalism, the notion that I suppose you could explain it better than I, but that Israel is about to be subsumed by foreign interlopers, and that will cease to be a Jewish democratic state. Speak a little bit about that point, if you will, and also generally what you are working on and what you're really focused on in your current role in the Second Thoughts Foundation and the newsletters you send out and so forth.
Well, while the focus of my research, my operation has always been U.S.-Israel relations as well as the Middle East at large, in recent years, I have invested much time together with friends in the U.S. and Israel, researching the actual demographic balance between Arabs and Jews in Israel, and I would say west of the Jordan River, namely in the combined area of Judea, Samaria, otherwise known as the West Bank, as well as pre-67 Israel, as well as Gaza Strip, by the way. And just like other areas of research, I've always tried to highlight the non-conventional element. And the conventional attitude towards demography has been that there is a demographic time bomb at the doorstep of Israel. And unless Israel takes a very painful retreat from Judea and Samaria, from the West Bank, Israel is going to become very soon Jewish minority society rather than Jewish majority. Researching that demographic conventional wisdom, researching it in the last 16 years, have produced a very well-documented conclusion, and a conclusion which is not based on assumptions or projections or assessments, but on hardcore facts, mostly, by the way, Palestinian documentation. Unlike the establishment in Israel and in the US, we have not amplified Palestinian numbers without auditing them. The team which I represent, 3 Americans, 6 Israelis, we have conducted a thorough audit of those numbers, and we have come to a very clear conclusion. The actual number of Arabs in Judea Samaria is about 1.2 million lower than the number which the establishment is amplifying, namely, it is about 1.8 million Arabs in Judea and Samaria, and therefore the overall balance currently is a 66% Jewish majority. Some may
How
say,
many Jews are in Judea Samaria at this point in time?
at this time, there are 1.8 million Arabs in Judea Samaria, side by side with 450,000 Jews. But it's not only the 66% Jewish majority in the combined area of Judea, Samaria, and pre-67 Israel, it's also the demographic trend. We're talking in the last 20, 30 years about an unprecedented westernization of Arab demography. The listeners, the viewers may not realize that, but contemporary Arab demography, namely level of fertility, number of babies, number of births per woman throughout the Arab world, has become westernized.
Is that throughout the entire Arab world, or you're speaking now predominantly of the local population?
No, I'm talking about, in fact, Muslim world from Iran, including Iran, all the way to Northwest Africa, excluding the sub-Sahara African Muslim societies. From Iran through Mauritania in Northwest Africa, we're talking about a culture, demographic culture today of something between 1 and 3 births per woman, unlike 6, 7, 9 births per woman only 20 or 30 years ago. At the same time, Jewish fertility rate inside Israel has experienced its most rapid increase in recent years, and especially among the secular Jews in Israel. In the last 15, 20 years, the ultra-Orthodox community in Israel has become unprecedentedly involved in the employment sector, more and more in academic sector to a small extent, but increasingly also in the military sector. That has led to a decline of about 1 birth per woman. But at the same time, the secular sector in Israel, which is by far the largest sector in Israel, has demonstrated an unprecedented enhancement of fertility. And today, among the yuppies of Tel Aviv, the talk is anywhere between 2 and 3 or 2 and 4 births per woman, while only 20 years ago it was 1 or 2. So we have, on one hand, Jewish community which benefits from a major, robust demographic tailwind, and at the same time, westernization of Arab demography. How have the Palestinians inflated the numbers? For instance, unlike all other societies in the world, they include, according to their own records, they include over 400,000 residents who have been away from the area for over a year. They count Arabs in Jerusalem, some 330,000 of them, but those Arabs are also counted by Israeli Arabs. We have a double count of 330,000 Arabs. There is another double count of over 100,000 Arabs from Judea and Samaria who married Israeli Arabs. and received Israeli ID cards. They're also doubly counted by Israel and by the Palestinian Authority. And then we found a major gap between the documentation of birth by the Palestinian ministries of health and education on the one hand, and the Palestinian Central Bureau of Statistics on the other hand. And more than that, we found out that the Palestinian Election Commission also agrees with the lower numbers of the Palestinian Health and Education Ministry. So we have a substantial artificial inflation of number of births by the Palestinian Authority, which, by the way, ignores the annual net emigration by Arabs away from Judea and Samaria. The bottom line, there is a solid 66% Jewish majority benefiting from tailwind, and anyone who is alarmed by 66% and wishing for a much higher percentage, let's remember Ben-Gurion accepted the partition plan back in 1947 with a 55% Jewish majority. He relied on Aliyah, on Jewish immigration, and by the way, in recent years, there's been very meager effort on the part of the Israeli government to encourage increased Aliyah to Israel. When you consider the size of the Jewish communities in the former USSR, plus Germany, plus England, plus the rest of Europe, you add to that the Jews of Argentina, as well as, by the way, the Jewish community in the US and Australia, to talk about 500,000 Olim to Israel in the next 5 years is a pretty moderate estimate, provided that the Israeli government retrieves the national order of priority, which was in Israel until the end of Prime Minister Shamir's term, highlighting the efforts for expanded Aliyah. Should Israel expand the effort for Aliyah? Should Israel prepare the housing and the transportation and the medical health infrastructures of incoming Olim? We will see a much higher Jewish majority in the country. The bottom line, there is a room for much optimism and determination, no room for pessimism and vacillation.
Sadly, it seems like the government has turned it away from encouraging Aliyah, at least to the Anglo countries, because of political considerations and the perception of condescension, of patronization. I guess you're not a fan of that approach.
No, I consider Aliyah to be the essence of the Jewish state. I don't put down Jewish communities outside of Israel, but I have no doubt that the Jewish state has a central role in setting the global Jewish agenda. I have no doubt that Jewish upbringing in the Jewish state is preferable to Jewish upbringing anywhere else. And when it comes to the interest, national security interest of the Jewish state, there's no doubt in my mind that Aliyah, the immigration of Jews to Israel, has been the number one factor of Israel's national security, Israel's economy, Israel's technology, and Israel's cultural life as a whole. Without Aliyah, probably there would be much weaker Israel. Maybe there wouldn't be a Jewish state at all.
What is contributing to the demographic shift among the Arab population? Why is the birth rate becoming so westernized, so to speak?
Well, we've seen the phenomena in Israel in particular, but throughout the Middle East, again, from the Persian Gulf to Northwest Africa, with Arab Muslim women enrolling or concluding 12 years of education unlike prior years of 20 years ago, when they used to get married at the age of 15, start reproductive process at the age of 16, continuing until the age of 55. In recent years, with the expansion of what I would call female independence throughout the Muslim world, throughout the Arab world, reflected by Arab women enrolled in 12 years of education, increasingly also in academic life. We have seen the whole reproductive process starting after the age of 20. Today, the average age of Arab women bearing their first child is over 20-year-old, and they stop at the age of 45, not at the age of 55. We have also seen an increased use of contraceptives throughout the Muslim world, and in fact, the leading Muslim country as far as contraceptives has been Morocco in North Africa. The number 2 Muslim society in the use of contraceptives has been the Palestinian society in Judea and Samaria in the West Bank. The number 3 society, by the way, Muslim society, has been Jordan, which shares very, very similar elements, social elements, with the Arabs in Israel and in Judea and Samaria.
Those are the Palestinians.
Absolutely, absolutely.
It's surprising, though. Would you not expect that this kind of a westernizing educational approach would also bring corresponding shifts in ideology? But it seems like there's a radicalization, if anything, not a rapprochement among the peoples there.
Well, we have to distinguish between the public at large and the regime, the rogue regime, which rules them. Sadly, all over the Middle East, we have had historically, until today at least, the phenomena of minority rogue regime controlling the majority, and the majority, for many reasons, being deterred by that rogue regime. In a way, the same applies to the Palestinians. It's less and less among Arabs in Israel, who are the most free society anywhere in the Arab world. There is the hate education among Palestinians. There is hate education among other Arabs, which has led to anti-Jewish way of thinking, but increasingly among those who interact with Israelis, there has been softening of the attitude towards Israel. And we have seen it, by the way, in series of Israeli elections, including the most recent one of few weeks ago. Around 50% voters, Arab voters turnout on national election day, unlike the around 90% turnout among Arabs when it comes to local election. And the question is, why do so many rush to the ballot when it comes to local election, and about 50% of them only showing up when it comes to national election? And the response is very clear. They do not respect, they do not trust the Arab parties which are represented at the Knesset, Arab parties which are anti-Israel, anti-Zionist. And we saw it, by the way, in a recent election in Nazareth about 8 years ago. There was an election, and until then, the eternal mayor of Nazareth faced a new guy on the block, and the mayor of Nazareth was a typical anti-Zionist, anti-Israel mayor. The challenger had an election slogan: "I care about Nazareth more than I care about Ramallah." And the new guy won already 2 rounds in Nazareth. The new guy is not identified with any of the Arab parties represented at the Knesset, and therefore I'm pretty optimistic when it comes to the future of coexistence in Israel, including in Judea Samaria, because the majority understands the benefits from collaboration with Israel and understands the damage caused by confrontation with Israel.
Yoram, in closing, what is next on the horizon for you? What are some of the projects that you're looking forward to? It sounds like, on the whole, you're an optimist in this arena, which is, I think, refreshing, where most people perhaps are not optimists, or maybe they would call themselves realists. What are you looking to do next? What do you still feel needs to be accomplished that you can contribute to the conversation?
Well, I've always tried to be a realist. I don't come from an ideological family. I don't come from an ideological youth movement. I've always based my position on hardcore facts, and I have been an optimist as a result of being a realist. I studied about the Jewish state in 1948, and I have watched the Jewish state in recent years, and the only conclusion has to be immensely optimistic. If one would have told the founding father, the giant Ben Gurion, back in 1948, that by 2019, the US and Israel are going to be global leaders in the development and manufacturing and launching of mini-size, small-size, and medium-size space satellites, even Ben Gurion, the ultra-optimist of those days, would have asked you, what have you been drinking? What have you been smoking? And here we are, 2019, and indeed, Israel has joined the US in leading in that area, as we have done in unmanned aerial vehicles, as we have done in the area of irrigation, as we have done in the area of artificial intelligence, as we have done, US and Israel, in the area of cyber technology. Israel has emerged as a global leader, and how can one be but an optimist when you watch that? My current focus is US-Israel relations, and I believe that there is a long way to go in presenting to Americans the unprecedented benefits to America derived from US ties with Israel. What does Israel produce for the US through Israel's military operations as well as high-tech and economic operations? I personally, I am not a believer in foreign aid to Israel. I believe that US-Israel relations are way, way above foreign aid. I am much more of a firm believer in US investment in Israel, which has produced literally hundreds of percentage of return every single year to the United States. And I'm very proud to reveal that I played a role in Prime Minister Netanyahu's decision back in 1996, 1997 to relieve Israel of non-military foreign aid, what was called Economic Support Fund. I hope that I can be useful in ridding US-Israel relations from the current military aid to Israel and exchange it with growing, expanded US-Israel joint investments, both in the area of national security as well as in the area of education, of social welfare, of economy at large, and specifically high tech.
Yoram, where can people learn more about what you're doing, read your work, both your previous works and your ongoing bulletins that you send out? And generally, where can people discover all that you've been involved with and continue to contribute?
Well, my weekly opinion columns, which I publish in English and Hebrew, are posted on my website, which is pretty easy to remember, In one word, the Ettinger Report, Ettinger with double T.com, the EttingerReport.com. One can read my columns as well as watch my brief series of videos on many issues which I deal with. One can also visit my Facebook account, which highlights those videos as well. And as I mentioned before, 3-5 times a year, I'm in the U.S., spending a few days on Capitol Hill and then venturing into the U.S. at large, mostly in the flyover areas of America, lecturing, briefing, and I'm open to invitation for speaking engagements on campuses, off campuses, Rotary clubs, Kiwanis, Lions, synagogues, temples.
Yoram Ettinger, a staunch defender of Israel, a creative and innovative thinker in this field, and really a treat to hear your passion for all things Israel and for your defense of the Jewish state. Thank you so much for joining us.
No, thank you for the opportunity, and especially to get to know you better, but more than that, to be exposed to many of your listeners, and I would welcome another such opportunity.
Yoram Ettinger, thank you very much.
Thank you.
This has been Ari Koretsky on Jews You Should Know. Please visit us at JewsYouShouldKnow.com and subscribe at iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you consume podcasts. Find us on social media at Jews You Should Know. If you'd like to become a supporter of this podcast, we would greatly appreciate that, and you can do so by visiting patreon.com. That's patreon.com/Jews You Should Know. Finally, if you have enjoyed this podcast, please leave us a review so that we can continue to grow and introduce many more people to Jews You Should Know.